Sometimes the most dangerous mistake a person can make is believing they already know who stands in front of them. The morning sun stretched across the wide entrance of Fort Liberty, painting long shadows over the rows of steel barriers and freshly polished guardrails as another ordinary Tuesday settled into its familiar rhythm. Military trucks rolled through the gates with practiced precision. Service members exchanged quiet greetings, and the distant echo of cadence calls drifted through the crisp North Carolina air. To anyone passing by, it looked like another peaceful day at one of America's most respected military installations. But within the next few minutes, one careless accusation would ripple across the entire base in a way no one present would ever forget. A black sedan eased toward the visitor checkpoint, its engine barely making a sound before coming to a smooth stop beside the inspection lane. The driver stepped out without hesitation. He appeared to be in his early 60s, dressed in a simple navy windbreaker, faded blue jeans, polished brown boots, and a plain baseball cap that revealed nothing remarkable about his identity. There were no medals on display, no entourage, no government vehicle, no visible sign that this quiet man deserved a second glance. He carried only a weathered leather portfolio tucked beneath one arm and wore the calm expression of someone who had learned long ago that true confidence never needed to announce itself. His name was Charles Monroe, although no one standing near the gate recognized it yet. Across the checkpoint, Officer Brandon Keller rested one hand against his patrol vehicle while scanning approaching traffic with practiced impatience. At 38 years old, Keller had built a reputation for trusting his instincts above everything else. He believed hesitation invited danger, and certainty projected authority. His polished badge reflected the morning sunlight as he watched Charles approach the security station with slow, measured steps. Something about the older man immediately caught his attention, though he couldn't explain exactly what. Maybe it was the confidence, maybe it was the silence, or maybe it was simply the fact that Charles didn't appear nervous the way most visitors did when confronted by law enforcement. Keller straightened his posture and raised his voice before Charles even reached the inspection table. "Hold it right there." Conversations nearby faded almost instantly. A few contractors waiting in line glanced toward the exchange before returning to their phones. Charles stopped exactly where instructed and offered a courteous nod. "Good morning, officer." His voice remained steady, respectful, almost disarmingly calm. Keller studied him for another long second, narrowing his eyes as if trying to solve a puzzle that refused to fit together. "Mind telling me what your business is here?" Charles lifted the leather portfolio slightly. "Official business." Keller frowned. "Official for who?" Charles answered without the slightest trace of irritation. "For the United States Army." The response should have ended the conversation. Instead, it marked the beginning of everything. Keller stepped closer, folding his arms across his chest as suspicion quietly replaced routine procedure. Around them, the sounds of the base continued uninterrupted, unaware that history had already begun shifting beneath ordinary footsteps. Charles remained perfectly still, never raising his voice, never arguing. Simply waiting with the patience of a man who understood that character is often revealed long before the truth ever arrives. Charles Monroe stood quietly beside the inspection table, the cool morning breeze barely stirring the brim of his weathered cap as military personnel continued moving through the entrance behind him with disciplined efficiency. Nothing about his posture suggested impatience. His shoulders remained relaxed, his breathing slow and even, his eyes calmly observing the organized rhythm that had shaped most of his adult life. Every salute exchanged beyond the checkpoint, every convoy rolling across the pavement, every flag fluttering above the headquarters building reminded him why he had chosen a lifetime of service. Respect was never supposed to begin with rank. It was supposed to begin with character. Officer Brandon Keller, however, saw something entirely different. The older man before him did not fit the image he had already constructed in his mind. Simple clothes, an old portfolio, no visible credentials hanging around his neck. Too composed, too confident. Keller had spent years convincing himself that experience allowed him to recognize trouble before anyone else could, and that belief quietly overpowered every opportunity to simply ask another question. He extended one hand toward the portfolio. "Open it." Charles met his eyes with the same composed expression. "I would be happy to present my identification through the proper security process." Keller frowned. "That was not what I asked." Several civilian contractors waiting nearby exchanged uncertain glances before pretending not to watch. A pair of young soldiers carrying equipment cases slowed their pace for only a moment before continuing toward a maintenance building. None of them wanted to interfere with what appeared to be a routine interaction. Charles slowly placed the leather portfolio on the inspection counter without the slightest sign of resistance. "Officer, I understand that you have a responsibility to protect this installation," he said evenly. "I respect that responsibility." Those words, delivered without sarcasm or frustration, somehow irritated Keller even more. He had expected excuses, complaints, or nervous explanations. Instead, he was met with calm confidence that refused to crack under pressure. "You seem awfully comfortable for someone who has not explained why he is here," Keller replied. Charles offered the faintest smile. "Experience teaches patience." Keller folded his arms once again. "Experience doing what exactly?" Charles glanced briefly toward the entrance beyond the barriers where the American flag moved gently against a cloudless sky before returning his attention to the officer. "Serving my country." The answer sounded ordinary enough, yet something about the way he said it lingered in the air. It was not pride. It was not arrogance. It sounded more like gratitude. Keller dismissed the feeling almost immediately. Plenty of people claimed to have served. That did not automatically grant unrestricted access to one of the nation's most secure military installations. A radio clipped to Keller's shoulder crackled with routine traffic from nearby patrol units. Vehicles continued arriving. Visitors checked in without incident. The base operated with its usual precision while this quiet conversation remained frozen at the front gate. Charles never glanced at his watch. He never sighed. He never demanded special treatment. Instead, he stood with remarkable stillness, as though time itself could not pressure him into abandoning his composure. One of the gate security specialists looked toward Keller, silently offering to assist, but Keller responded with only a subtle shake of his head. He intended to handle this himself. Charles noticed the exchange, but said nothing. Deep inside the installation, far beyond the checkpoint, a staff vehicle turned onto the main boulevard several hundred yards away. No siren sounded. No alarms echoed across the base. The morning still appeared perfectly ordinary. Yet unseen by everyone gathered at the entrance, the first pieces of a much larger picture had already begun moving quietly into place. Officer Brandon Keller tapped the edge of the leather portfolio with 2 fingers but made no effort to open it. Instead, he kept studying Charles Monroe, searching for signs of uncertainty that never appeared. It was almost unsettling. Most people standing at a military checkpoint under close questioning shifted their weight, stumbled over their words, or reached instinctively for their identification. Charles did none of those things. He simply stood there with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades making difficult decisions without raising his voice. Keller interpreted that composure as arrogance. "You keep saying you are here on official business," he said. "Then give me one reason I should believe you." Charles answered without hesitation. "Because the truth does not become more truthful when it is spoken louder." The words lingered between them for a moment. A nearby construction worker lowered his coffee cup, pretending to check his phone while listening from the corner of his eye. 2 military police officers driving through another access lane briefly noticed the exchange before continuing toward the interior of the installation. Morning traffic flowed normally, yet an invisible tension had begun settling over the checkpoint. Keller exhaled slowly, convinced the older man was deliberately avoiding simple questions. "Do you know how many people try to bluff their way on a government property every year?" Charles nodded once. "Enough that every officer should remain alert." "Then help me understand why you're making this difficult." Charles looked directly at him. I am answering every question respectfully. Difficulty often begins when assumptions arrive before facts. Keller's jaw tightened. He had heard enough carefully chosen words. To him, confidence without visible proof sounded like manipulation. His attention shifted briefly toward the worn leather portfolio resting on the counter. It looked old enough to have traveled thousands of miles. The edges had softened with age, and the brass clasp showed years of careful use. Whatever it contained clearly mattered to its owner, yet Charles made no move to protect it or pull it closer. He simply allowed it to remain where it was, almost as though the contents would reveal themselves when the right moment arrived. Beyond the checkpoint, inside the headquarters complex, several senior officers unexpectedly changed direction after receiving short messages over secure communications. Staff members quietly adjusted schedules. Vehicles that had been parked moments earlier began moving toward the administrative side of the base. None of those changes caused panic. They reflected disciplined efficiency, the kind that only existed inside organizations accustomed to responding without unnecessary questions. Back at the entrance, however, none of that activity was visible. Keller believed he still controlled the entire situation. "Last chance," he said firmly. "Tell me exactly who authorized your visit." Charles remained silent for only a second before answering with remarkable calm. "The people expecting me already know I am here." Keller gave a humorless laugh. Convenient answer. Charles did not react. Instead, his eyes drifted briefly toward the enormous American flag waving above the command building nearly half a mile away. The morning sunlight caught the fabric as it moved steadily against the blue sky, and for the first time, a faint expression of reflection crossed his face. It was not worry. It was not frustration. It looked more like someone remembering countless mornings that had begun beneath the same flag over an entire lifetime of service. Keller noticed the glance, but misunderstood it completely. "Looking for someone to rescue you?" he asked. Charles slowly returned his attention to the officer and answered with a voice so steady that even the contractors standing nearby stopped pretending not to listen. "No, officer. I'm simply waiting for everyone to arrive exactly when they are supposed to." The silence at the checkpoint gradually became heavier than the steady flow of traffic passing through the neighboring security lanes. Officer Brandon Keller no longer viewed the encounter as a routine inspection. In his mind, the quiet confidence, standing only a few feet away, had transformed into something suspicious, something that demanded to be challenged rather than understood. Charles Monroe remained exactly where he had been asked to stand, his weathered leather portfolio resting on the inspection counter, his hands visible, his expression composed. He did not glance toward the gathering onlookers. He did not complain about the delay. He simply waited with remarkable patience, as though he understood that time often revealed far more than arguments ever could. Keller stepped around the counter and slowly circled toward Charles, studying every detail with growing determination. The faded jacket, the polished boots that had clearly been cared for over many years, the old military-style wristwatch whose scratched crystal reflected the morning sun. Everything looked ordinary, yet somehow nothing felt ordinary. That contradiction irritated him more than he cared to admit. "You still have not convinced me that you belong anywhere near this installation," Keller said firmly. Charles met his eyes without raising his voice. Belonging is not always something you can recognize at first glance. Keller folded his arms once again. "That sounds like another way of avoiding a direct answer." Charles gently shook his head. "No, officer. It is simply experience speaking." Several civilians waiting to enter the base quietly shifted farther down the sidewalk, pretending to continue their conversations while watching the exchange unfold from a respectful distance. Even the security personnel assigned to nearby lanes had begun casting occasional glances toward the checkpoint, sensing that the conversation had extended well beyond an ordinary identification check. One young specialist inside the gate recognized something familiar about Charles. It was not his clothing or his face alone. It was the unmistakable posture. Years of military service had taught him to recognize disciplined bearing even without a uniform. He paused for only a second before reaching discreetly for his radio, speaking so quietly that no one outside the security booth could hear the brief transmission. Charles noticed the movement from the corner of his eye, but showed no reaction whatsoever. Keller, focused entirely on his own conclusions, never saw it happen. Instead, he pointed toward the visitor parking area. "You can wait over there until someone verifies your story." Charles answered politely, "I will wait wherever you believe is appropriate." There was not a trace of resentment in his voice. If anything, his calmness seemed to deepen. That response unsettled Keller more than open disagreement ever could have. Most people defended themselves when questioned. Most people became frustrated when delayed. Charles didn't either. He simply treated every word with measured respect. The quiet confidence made Keller feel as though he was somehow losing control of a situation that still appeared completely under his authority. Deep inside the command headquarters, several senior officers exited a briefing room earlier than scheduled after receiving unexpected updates. Staff members began moving with greater purpose through the hallways, exchanging brief acknowledgments instead of lengthy conversations. Outside, two command vehicles changed direction and headed steadily toward the main entrance. Without activating emergency lights, their movement appeared routine to anyone unfamiliar with military operations. Yet every person inside those vehicles understood that timing suddenly mattered. Back at the checkpoint, Keller looked directly at Charles and spoke with complete certainty. "Until I know exactly who you are, I have every reason to believe you should not be here." Charles slowly nodded, almost thoughtfully, before offering a quiet reply that drifted through the cool morning air with surprising weight. "Then I hope, officer, that when the truth arrives, you will judge it more carefully than you judge the man standing in front of you." Charles Monroe remained beside the inspection counter with the same composed posture he had maintained since arriving at the entrance. The growing attention around the checkpoint seemed to pass through him without changing his expression in the slightest. Contractors quietly whispered to one another. A delivery driver waiting several vehicles back leaned forward to see what was causing the unusual delay. Even a few soldiers crossing between nearby buildings allowed themselves quick, curious glances before continuing toward their assignments. Everyone sensed that something unusual was unfolding, yet no one could explain why. Officer Brandon Keller interpreted the silence differently. To him, every passing minute without a clear explanation only reinforced his confidence that he had made the correct decision. He believed patience belonged to those who followed instructions immediately, not to someone who answered simple questions with calm observations and measured words. "You have had plenty of opportunities to explain yourself," Keller said. "Instead, you keep speaking in riddles." Charles answered with the same steady tone that had never once risen above ordinary conversation. "The truth rarely needs decoration." Keller gave a skeptical smile. "Truth usually comes with identification." Charles nodded slightly. "And it will." The response only deepened Keller's frustration. He looked toward the security booth where one of the gate specialists had quietly stepped away from the window moments earlier. Assuming nothing important was happening behind the scenes, Keller turned his attention back to Charles without noticing that another brief radio transmission had just been acknowledged inside the building. Beyond the checkpoint, the atmosphere across the installation began shifting in subtle ways invisible to most visitors. Administrative staff walked with greater purpose between offices. Several command personnel unexpectedly adjusted their schedules. Two senior, non-commissioned officers left the conference room before the meeting had officially ended. None of those actions caused alarm. They reflected something else entirely. Preparation. At the front gate, however, the ordinary sounds of the base continued. Flags moved gently above the parade field. Engines hummed in the distance. The rhythm of military life remained calm, disciplined, and orderly. Charles looked toward the rows of buildings beyond the entrance with an expression that suggested familiarity rather than curiosity. Every road, every flagpole, every brick pathway carried memories of decades spent serving something larger than himself. He had watched generations of young soldiers arrive, uncertain, and leave transformed by responsibility. He had attended ceremonies celebrating achievement and quiet gatherings honoring sacrifice. Through every season, one lesson had remained unchanged. Character revealed itself most clearly when no one believed they were being tested. Keller broke the silence once again. "You seem unusually confident for someone waiting to be verified." Charles looked back at him with calm sincerity. Confidence built over a lifetime is difficult to shake during a single morning. Keller crossed his arms. "You still believe someone important is coming?" Charles paused for a brief moment before answering. "No, officer. I believe the right people always arrive exactly when duty calls them." Those words settled over the checkpoint with unexpected weight. One contractor quietly lowered his phone after realizing he had stopped pretending to check messages several minutes earlier. Another visitor glanced toward the road, leading deeper into the installation after noticing several command vehicles approaching. From the distance, at a measured pace. They were not speeding. They were not using emergency lights. Yet their synchronized movement immediately caught the attention of experienced military personnel nearby. Charles noticed them as well, though he showed no excitement. Instead, he gently rested one hand on the weathered leather portfolio and offered a quiet smile that carried neither satisfaction nor triumph. It was simply the peaceful expression of a man who knew that patience was about to allow the truth to speak for itself. The distant command vehicles continued their steady approach, moving with quiet precision along the broad avenue that led toward the installation's main entrance. There were no flashing lights, no hurried maneuvers, and no signs of panic. Yet something about their perfectly coordinated pace immediately caught the attention of the soldiers nearest the checkpoint. Experienced service members recognized the difference between ordinary transportation and deliberate movement directed from the highest levels of command. Officer Brandon Keller noticed the vehicles as well, but he dismissed them with barely a glance. Fort Liberty was a busy installation. Senior officers came and went throughout the day. Convoys traveled between headquarters and training areas every hour. There was nothing unusual about official vehicles appearing on the main road. What mattered to him remained standing only a few feet away. Charles Monroe rested one hand lightly upon the worn leather portfolio while watching the approaching vehicles with the same quiet expression he had carried all morning. There was no hint of relief on his face, no smile of victory, only patient certainty. Keller interpreted that calm as confidence built upon a story that was about to collapse. "It looks like you are hoping someone inside knows your name," Keller remarked. Charles answered gently, "Names matter far less than service." Keller shook his head. "Everyone says something noble when they're trying to impress people." Charles slowly looked toward the American flag flying above the command complex before answering. "Real service is never performed for applause." The words settled into the cool morning air, leaving several nearby listeners unexpectedly silent. One young specialist standing inside the security booth glanced toward his computer monitor after receiving an updated notification. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly before he immediately reached for the secure telephone instead of the public radio. He spoke quietly for only a few seconds, then stood a little straighter without saying another word. Outside the booth, nothing appeared different. Visitors still waited patiently. Contractors continued checking delivery paperwork. The routine rhythm of the installation seemed completely unchanged. Yet beneath that ordinary surface, information was now traveling through command channels with remarkable speed. Inside headquarters, several senior leaders had already redirected their schedules. A protocol officer stepped outside the administrative building carrying a neatly folded folder. Two command sergeants quietly positioned themselves near the front entrance without exchanging unnecessary conversation. No one raised their voice. No one questioned the instructions they had just received. Duty simply moved from one person to the next with practiced discipline. Back at the checkpoint, Keller remained convinced that the situation rested entirely under his control. "I have seen plenty of people claim connections they never had," he said. "Eventually the truth catches up with them." Charles nodded respectfully. "I agree." Keller looked almost surprised by the response. "You do?" "Always," Charles replied. The truth has a remarkable habit of arriving exactly on time. For the first time since the conversation began, Keller found himself without an immediate answer. Before he could speak again, a quiet change swept across the entrance. Several soldiers walking between nearby buildings instinctively slowed their pace and turned toward the approaching road. The conversations around the checkpoint gradually faded. Even the contractors stopped speaking. The synchronized movement of the command vehicles had become impossible to ignore. They rolled forward with deliberate precision before coming to a smooth stop near the entrance, their doors remaining closed for a brief, almost ceremonial moment. Charles Monroe never moved. He simply stood beside the inspection counter with calm dignity, his weather portfolio still resting beneath his hand, while the entire atmosphere around the checkpoint shifted from routine procedure to unmistakable anticipation, as though everyone present had suddenly realized they were about to witness something far more important than an ordinary morning at the front gate. The doors of the command vehicles opened almost simultaneously, and several senior officers stepped onto the pavement with measured confidence. Their uniforms were immaculate, their movements disciplined, and their expressions carried the quiet focus of leaders responding to something that required absolute precision. No one rushed. No one raised a voice. Yet the atmosphere at the checkpoint changed in an instant. Conversations stopped. Engines idled unnoticed. Even the breeze seemed to fade beneath the growing silence. Officer Brandon Keller instinctively straightened his posture, expecting the visitors to confirm that his caution had been justified. Instead, every pair of eyes moved past him. The officers walked directly toward Charles Monroe. A distinguished colonel reached him first and came to a complete stop only a few feet away. Without hesitation, he rendered a sharp military salute. "Good morning, General Monroe. We sincerely apologize for the unexpected delay." The words landed with stunning clarity. For one long moment, nobody moved. The contractors waiting in line looked from Charles to the officers as though they had misheard what had just been said. The young specialist inside the security booth lowered his head slightly, finally understanding why the secure notification had arrived with such urgency. Keller remained frozen, his confident expression giving way to disbelief as the title echoed inside his mind. "General." Before he could process another thought, additional senior officers formed a respectful line behind the colonel. One after another, they saluted Charles with quiet professionalism. There was no theatrical display, no dramatic annoncement, only the unmistakable discipline of the United States Army honoring one of its highest-ranking leaders. Charles returned each salute with calm dignity before offering a warm smile. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming." His voice had not changed. It carried the same steady kindness he had shown since arriving at the gate. The only difference was that everyone finally understood why. The colonel looked toward the inspection counter, where the weathered leather portfolio still rested untouched. "Your briefing materials are ready, sir. The command staff has assembled exactly as scheduled." Charles nodded appreciatively. "Excellent. I did not wish to keep anyone waiting." Keller stared at the simple windbreaker, the faded jeans, and the old leather portfolio that moments earlier had seemed so ordinary. Now every detail appeared completely different. The polished boots reflected decades of discipline. The quiet posture reflected confidence earned through service rather than demanded through authority. Even the old portfolio suddenly looked less like worn luggage and more like the trusted companion of a lifetime devoted to duty. Several soldiers crossing the roadway noticed the gathering of senior leaders and immediately recognized the distinguished officer standing beside the checkpoint. Without receiving instructions, they came to attention. Within seconds, more service members noticed the scene. The movement spread naturally across the entrance like a silent wave of respect. Heads turned. Conversations disappeared. Salutes rose one after another throughout the surrounding area, as recognition replaced uncertainty. Charles acknowledged them with quiet humility, never allowing the attention to linger on himself. His focus remained on the people before him rather than the rank upon his shoulders. Keller finally found his voice, though it sounded far quieter than before. "General, I did not know. Charles turned toward him with the same calm expression that had never left his face all morning. There was no anger in his eyes, no satisfaction, no desire to embarrass anyone, only quiet understanding. "I know, officer," he replied gently. "That is why every person deserves to be treated with respect before their title is ever known." Officer Brandon Keller lowered his eyes for a brief moment. The confidence that had defined every word he had spoken throughout the morning quietly replaced by reflection. Around the checkpoint, the atmosphere remained remarkably disciplined. No one whispered. No one celebrated. The soldiers who had recognized General Charles Monroe simply returned to their duties after rendering their salutes, each understanding that genuine professionalism required neither spectacle nor unnecessary attention. Charles reached for the weathered leather portfolio that had rested on the inspection counter since his arrival. He lifted it carefully, brushing a small trace of dust from the worn surface before turning toward the senior officers waiting beside him. "Thank you for meeting me here," he said warmly. "Let us continue with the inspection. We have important work ahead of us." The colonel nodded immediately. "Yes, sir." Before taking another step, Charles paused and looked back toward Keller. The officer remained standing where he was, clearly searching for the right words, but finding none that seemed sufficient. Charles slowly walked back until only a few feet separated them once again. His voice remained calm enough that everyone nearby could hear every word without strain. "Officer Keller, protecting a military installation is a serious responsibility. You should never apologize for doing your job." Keller looked up with visible surprise. Charles continued before the officer could answer. "But every responsibility carries another obligation that is just as important." Keller listened silently. "Every person who stands before you deserves the same measure of dignity until facts prove otherwise. Uniforms, titles, clothing, age, race, and first impressions can all mislead us. Respect should never wait for identification." The words settled deeply over everyone gathered near the entrance. Several younger soldiers exchanged thoughtful glances, understanding that they had just witnessed something far greater than an ordinary security check. This had become a lesson in leadership. Keller slowly nodded. "You are right, General. I allowed my assumptions to speak before I allowed the facts to speak." Charles offered a gentle smile, recognizing that difference is where real growth begins. The colonel quietly stepped forward and handed Charles a tablet containing the schedule for the day's inspection. Charles reviewed it briefly before closing the cover. "Very good. We will stay with the original timeline." The colonel hesitated for only a moment. "Sir, if you would prefer, we can postpone the inspection after everything that happened here this morning." Charles shook his head almost immediately. "Absolutely not. The mission does not pause because someone makes a mistake. We learn from mistakes. Then we continue serving." Those nearby heard the answer with quiet admiration. There was no desire for revenge, no request for punishment, no effort to use authority to settle a personal score. Instead, Charles demonstrated exactly why thousands of soldiers trusted his leadership. His rank had earned him authority, but his character had earned something far greater. As the command group prepared to walk toward headquarters, one of the younger specialists approached the inspection counter and carefully placed the visitor log where Charles had first arrived. Looking at the signature that had been entered only minutes earlier, the specialist quietly realized something remarkable. General Charles Monroe had signed his full name from the very beginning. He had never hidden his identity. He had never invented story. He had simply allowed everyone else the opportunity to decide what kind of person they wished to be before the truth introduced itself. And in that quiet realization, the lesson became impossible for anyone present to forget. General Charles Monroe walked toward the command headquarters at an unhurried pace, surrounded not by ceremony, but by professionals who had dedicated their lives to serving something greater than themselves. The morning sunlight reflected softly across the sidewalks of Fort Liberty as soldiers resumed their assignments with renewed focus. Yet many quietly carried the memory of what they had just witnessed. Word traveled quickly across the installation, not through rumors or exaggerated stories, but through respectful conversations about a lesson that no leadership manual could fully teach. Inside the headquarters building, the day's inspection continued exactly as planned. Charles reviewed readiness reports, asked thoughtful questions, listened carefully to junior officers, and thanked enlisted personnel for their dedication. He treated every individual with the same courtesy, whether they wore the insignia of a senior commander or had only recently begun their military career. Those who served under him understood why his reputation had spread far beyond the walls of any single installation. His authority came from his rank, but his influence came from the example he chose to set every day. Outside, Officer Brandon Keller remained at the checkpoint, carrying on with his responsibilities in complete silence. The events of the morning replayed in his mind again and again. He remembered every assumption he had made before asking enough questions. He remembered judging simple clothing instead of patient character. Most of all, he remembered the calm kindness General Monroe had shown even after every misunderstanding. That kindness weighed more heavily than any criticism ever could. Over the following weeks, those who worked alongside Keller noticed subtle changes. He greeted visitors before questioning them. He listened longer before reaching conclusions. He paid closer attention to facts instead of first impressions. His responsibilities remained exactly the same, but the way he carried them reflected a deeper understanding of what public service truly required. Respect had become the starting point rather than the reward. General Monroe never mentioned the incident during meetings, interviews, or official reports. When asked privately about the unexpected delay at the entrance, he simply smiled and redirected the conversation toward the mission of supporting the men and women who wore the nation's uniform every day. He believed leadership was not measured by how many mistakes someone could expose, but by how many people could grow because of one honest moment. Months later, a young lieutenant attending a leadership seminar asked Charles what quality mattered most in someone trusted with authority. The room became completely still as he considered the question. Finally, he answered with the same quiet certainty that had defined him throughout his career. Never allow another person's appearance to become more convincing than the truth. Titles may tell you what someone does. Character tells you who they are. The audience remained silent for several seconds before writing down every word. Many would remember that answer for the rest of their lives. Long after that morning at the checkpoint had faded into history, one lesson continued echoing through every conversation it inspired. Real leadership begins long before recognition arrives. Real integrity exists even when no one knows your name. And real respect is never something that should be earned only after a title is revealed. It should be given freely because every human being deserves to be seen before they are judged. On that ordinary morning, one man arrived wearing simple clothes and carrying an old leather portfolio. He left exactly the same way. The only thing that had changed was the understanding of everyone who had met him. They discovered that the greatest measure of authority is not how many people stand when you enter the room. It is how many lives become better because of the example you leave behind. For in the end, a uniform may represent power, but character is what gives that power its lasting meaning. Please like and subscribe to the channel to hear more stories of justice.